Drugs to control nausea and vomiting. To understand how these drugs work, let's look at the way vomiting is controlled in the brain. In the medulla of the brain, there's an area called the vomiting center. And the role of the vomiting center is to integrate various signals from various parts of the body in order to decide whether or not to vomit. One of the inputs to the vomiting center is called the chemoreceptor trigger zone. Or the CTZ. The CTZ feeds into the vomiting center, and what it does is it detects chemicals in the plasma which might indicate that there's something wrong and that you need to vomit. In the CTZ there are a number of receptors. There are D2 dopamine receptors. There are also 5-HT3 receptors, which is serotonin. So these are potential targets for drugs. The vomiting center also has input from a number of sources, including the gut and the heart, and these feed into the chemoreceptor trigger zone, and that enables us to respond to toxins in those areas. Importantly, in the gut we have lots of 5-HT receptors. In fact, most of the 5-HT receptors in the body are in the gut. There are also inputs from the vestibular system, and that's why you get seasick, because you get input from the vestibular system which indicates that there's a conflict with what you see, and the brain interprets that as being, well, there must be some toxin floating around somewhere. The vestibular system contains histamine H1 receptors and also muscarinic M1 ACH receptors. So all of these are potential and are indeed targets for antiemetics. So let's have a look at some of the drugs we can use to control these receptors. One of them is a drug called hyoscine. It's a very early drug, and hyoscine blocks muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. So then hyoscine, our first drug, is acting here, and so it's very good for motion sickness. Other drugs used in treating nausea and vomiting are drugs which target 5-HT receptors, and of these, the most significant are the 5-HT, the cetrons. So, for example, ondansetron, which blocks 5-HT3 receptors, and particularly good for radiation and post-operative vomiting. The third target, which might have stuck out, you might have noticed, stuck out for you if that's the right phrase, is blocking dopamine receptors, and so here D2 antagonists such as metoclopramide, or another one is domperidone, which is particularly good for if you're giving this to someone with Parkinson's disease. Their problem is lack of dopamine. So what you don't want to do is to lower their responsiveness to dopamine. So domperidone is good because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. The CTZ is actually outside the blood-brain barrier. So these drugs then block D2 dopamine receptors. So there are other drugs that don't fall into this category quite so neatly. So these would include some new cannabinoid drugs, and NK1 receptors antagonists, such as neurokinin, such as fosaprepitant. So that's a survey of how we control nausea and vomiting.